Great day in the morning. We are going to be talking about the oversold themes and genres for RPGs. The first one on the list is ensemble heists. And this trope is static. The villains are not necessarily villainous, but instead are static defensively. And the players are only playing as foxes to the geese, so to speak. And so there's not the danger presented to the adventuring group that puts them in any serious risk of elimination. Ensemble heists generally have a collaborative feel to them, and they are rather feel good if we're looking at them in terms of motion pictures. Who doesn't like the concept, at least behind the Oceans 11, 12, and so on series. The idea of a group gathering together, putting together a plan, and then watching that plan alternatively fall to near destruction and then succeed and overcome is it's a roller coaster ride for entertainment, and it definitely gets the job done in terms of excitement. So, from a role play standpoint, the ensemble heist genre was typified in the last couple of years with the Dragon Heist module and that series of adventures that came out. And so that's a primary genre that I think has been oversold and overdone and kind of is tired. Next of the genres that I feel is perhaps oversold is the concept of the survival or subsistence stories game. And this may have been actually been pretty much played to death outside of tabletop RPGs in advance of the collapse that I'm seeing in survival games now. But the concept of starting with nothing, getting through the worst of a collapse or a destructive process in order to thrive and return to a state of normalcy. This concept was played in particular through the Dungeons and Dragons franchise, specifically in the last 3 or 4 years through the Tomb of Annihilation series. That adventure was nothing if not a survival story. You had a known collapse of spellcraft. There was a clear villain that was bent on destroying the world, and there was actually time clock built into the story wherein the villain would win if the party did nothing. And this kind of thrive despite your survival is, I think, overdone. Other product that fall into this same situation would be, I would argue, the Ravensloft series, that being a subsistence story where the burden of mere existence is so painful and difficult and odious to deal with that the party's success is almost non-existent, and their desire to try to avoid much of the villainy and the bad things actually overtakes the necessity of being a good person and a sacrificial one. It fundamentally leaves the players with a holding the bag kind of mindset where they are simply doing what needs to be done. And although it's not the full railroad that some players might recommend or suggest, it is a difficult world to feel like you're making any headway because it's very difficult to see where the advances lie. I believe that these forms of RPGs, the survival mode and the subsistence mode, are both played to death both in motion pictures and in RPGs, simply because there is such a blast of them that have been put out. The movie series like Evil Dead or not wrong one. Evil Dead. That's okay. That ending of the world was rather clever, but the one I'm referring to is Resident Evil. Resident Evil, 28 Days, Zombieland. These are all great stories, and they do have the survival and or subsistence level to them, and they can be enjoyable. But if you had a simple diet of the same thing over and over again, the appeal of that starts to fall away. And so, even the best sequence of Zombieland movies to break up the monotony of the more world-shattering versions of Resident Evil or those kind of franchises is a challenge, and I think that we're seeing a shundering of a collapse, if you will, of the survival or subsistence stories as a valid trope to pursue. Next, and this one probably is the granddaddy of them all, arguably probably one of the oldest ones, and this is the world-ending artifact hunt. Most clearly typified by the 800-pound gorilla in the room, Lord of the Rings. The very idea that there is a singular artifact, item, device that is going to save the world or destroy the world or decapitate the world or elevate it. The concept is that it's going to end an age, it's going to change the world, it's going to make everything different. This concept has been done again and again, and because it's so successful, it's really a good storyline. We love to think that we have found the one thing that will make the world a better place, that we have the one piece of information that nobody else has, and we love the idea that the problems of the world are going to end because of something very simple, very easy to deal with in a way, and yet requires huge sacrifices. So that's a trope that I think has been done to death in the role play environment, and so it's hard to think of a role playing game that doesn't use this. As a matter of fact, there have been several places in game master forums where I've seen arguments begin and end with the world-ending artifact as the king trope to the entire industry. And I don't think it is. I think it was the catalyst. There were certainly open concepts for role play early on after the development of Dungeons and Dragons that came to the fore relatively quickly. We could go into those at some point in the future, but I think that the world-ending artifact hunt was so powerful that it set a mark, if you will, upon the entire genre, and the power of the very first product to capitalize on it was the most successful with it. The next form of genre that we're going to talk about is the overtaking of a clearly evil government. And this doesn't necessarily mean that the villainy is so clear as to be unmistakable. But movies like Krull is a good example. Or, oh gosh, Chain Reaction, I just watched it the other day. Or 1984. There are so many different forms of evil governments that need to be overthrown. Star Wars is an overtaking of a clearly evil government. This universe, even in the, if you will, the Indiana Jones series theming, you have a bit of the overtaking of the clearly evil government when you're speaking, in that case, of a certain country in Middle Europe. Wore red and marched in straight lines and goose-stepped a lot. They were clearly the evil government that needed to be overthrown. So genres and whatever that do this are very famous, and they have been played to the nth degree. I have observed players who were in campaigns that this was the objective, that some governmental power had come to play. And well, even Robin Hood is a great example of this kind of story. You're trying to overthrow an evil government in any way, shape, or form you can, and that process is the game mechanism. Well, that's great, but when you do it and do it over and again, eventually it becomes rather stale. The next one may be a less of an American issue, but the concept of avenging a family wrong or overcoming a cultural mistake, these kinds of vengeance films and tropes drive a lot of stories, and particularly in the case of many sandboxes, are sort of driven by the quirks and flaws that players build into their characters, usually through their backstories that put them on a path to fixing some error in their past or affording up the opportunity for change to occur by their actions. While it has been played to death in certain categories and genres, it's not necessarily as heavily beaten to death, if you will, in the Dungeons and Dragons framework. But in a way, the Ravensloft mentions and deals with a bit of this, and there's even some of this in my brain's right on this one. The one that's sitting in Baldur's Gate now. I'll think of it here in a second. But the concept, well, evil, and it's also even found in the Dragon Heist that there's a bit of family vengeance issues as the Neverembers are blamed for things and such. So I think that this, although it's not as heavily beaten to death, it is one that is almost identifiable just simply by the way the game master describes the game that he's going to run. And the last that one I think that is really heavily crushed into worthlessness or invalidity is the murder hobo loot grabs. The very thought of games like Munchkin or other board games that make fun of roleplay games is that they are super focused on the very aspects that make for, I don't know, tropic humor about role playing, and one of those is the concept of the murder hobo. The idea that the players literally are determining what kind of loot or treasure they're going to get from the actual destruction of, murder of, or killing of, the townskeep or the children in an orphanage. I mean, that's a classic tropic joke about how much would we get if we burned down an orphanage. It's like you're missing the point. You're defeating the purpose, and you're calling out, I guess, the stupidity of classic roleplay games when you grant those types of PCs or NPCs this kind of negative landscape. So, also, it's not even necessarily just the fact that there's murder hobos and challenges that way. It's actually more to the point that these are actually doing so almost in a race to the bottom, so to speak, where they're actually taking into account whether or not this person got the most loot or that person gets more experience for the ones that he's killed off or whatever. Finally, and possibly the least overworked, but still nonetheless worked out of these oversold themes, is the Game Master's pet story train. And by this I mean many times a Game Master will spend as many years as I have being a Game Master and storyteller and have built a long theme story that requires certain accomplishments to be achieved. And I have found, even in my own 8th iteration, there were players who drove their portion of the story based on their attempt to derail the story train. And it isn't the story train isn't a good thing. The story train can be both a good and bad thing if the players either are not directly motivated or have not gathered enough information to care yet. But the concept that the story must play out the way the storyteller has in his mind is the problem part, and I had to discover that in my 8th iteration. And the decision of how things came to pass became far less important than that they came to pass. And so the standard story train is a problem and needs to be put out to pasture for a while. It's not that any or all of these aren't valid for a story arc. There's not a reason for any one of them to be eliminated from your player pool. It's just the awareness that they are sort of overworked and old saw like will cut down the number of players who become disinterested and walk away from your game. If you have seen anything in this video that makes sense to you, and if you can think of other other oversold themes, make sure you leave those in the comments if you would, because I'd love to see them. And if you like what you've seen in the video, be sure to follow all the routines. Go down and there's the word like a submarine, but I always forget what that word is. It has something to do with the old process of writing. I know many of you don't remember this, but there was a time when we used pencils and wrote and drew on pieces of chewed up paper. I know it's really strange, but if you go down there and subscribe, it'd be greatly appreciated. And if you like the video, give a thumbs up. If you are on Twitch and want to be a part of these shows, click on the like button and leave a message, and we'll see what we can do. I now have the opportunity to have guests on the show. I'm starting to figure out how that all works, so I would be glad to have you on with us. I will be continuing a secondary segment to the show right after this ends. That's called the debrief, and it follows from an old tradition that I used to run for all of my role play groups. And it's the concept that after the game session, after all the games of the week, you have a chance to relax, maybe have a cold beverage, shoot the breeze, and talk about how the games have gone in the week and what could be happening in the future. So stick with us for the debrief. I'm Jonathan Albin. This has been the Game Master Soapbox. Have a great day. I'll be right back with the debrief.